Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. Well, thank you for being here. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Ripstein, who's professor at the University of Toronto. He's university professor in the Faculty of Law in the Department of Philosophy. And he is the author of very influential books in legal theory and in particular in Kant's doctrine of right and Kant's philosophy of law and political philosophy. The books are Kant and the Law of War from 2021, Rules for Wrongdoers, also from 2021, Private Wrongs from 2016, Force and Freedom, Kant's Legal and Political Philosophy from 2009, and Equality, Responsibility, and the Law from 1999. He was awarded the Journal of the History of Philosophy Book Prize in 2022, was a Tanner Lecturer at the University of California, Berkeley in 2019, and won the Killian Prize for the Humanities in 2022, among many other remarkable achievements that we could mention. He's a very important figure, and in particular in Kant, in discussions on in scholarship on Kant's political philosophy and Kant's doctrine of right, and it's my great privilege to have him here, and thank you for being us. And he's going to talk to us about Kant and the books.
Thank you so much, Faviola, for that generous introduction. What I want to do today is talk to you give a Kantian account of the nature of democracy. I want to talk about the sense in which, in a democracy, the citizens can be understood to be giving laws to themselves. There's much that is appealing in the idea of people who are subject to laws being also the author of those laws. It's appealing as kind of as a slogan. Giving laws to ourselves is almost uplifting. It's so appealing. At the same time, it's deeply puzzling because there are various ways in which we might try to understand that, and many of them have long histories in political philosophy and are very difficult to make out once you look at them closely. So as a slogan, the people give the laws to themselves, it's great. And then you read the fine print and you find out something's missing. So what I want to do is develop a distinctively Kantian picture of it. I'm going to do that in several stages. I'm first going to begin by saying something about the way in which Kant emphasizes the importance of formal as opposed to material or empirical features throughout his philosophy. Because the problem about the sense in which people give laws to themselves is, in Kant's technical idiom, a problem about the synthetic a priori. That is, a synthetic principle connects something to something else that is distinct from it. A cause from its effect, for example. A substance from its accident. The substance could persist with different accidents. The cause and the effect are contingently related to each other. A synthetic a priori principle is a principle that explains how there can be a kind of necessitation. For example, the way in which the cause produces its effect. The effect necessarily follows from the cause, whatever that means. Or again, in legal philosophy, you have to honor your contracts. That is a requirement. There's a form of necessitation. But in both the case of the causation and in the case of contractual performance, it is necessitation with respect to a contingent matter. That is, the synthetic a priori principle that says every event has a cause deals with causes that we have to discover through experience. It's not going to tell you what causes what else. It's going to tell you that things have causes, that we are entitled to that relation. But that's a relation that connects a contingent matter. So too with contractual performance. You have to keep your contract with me because we made a contract. We didn't have to make the contract. part of what it is for something to be a contract is for it to be up to the parties making it to decide whether to enter into it or not. Maybe you've made a contract with me to cut my lawn next week. You could have made a contract, you would have been prudent to make a contract with someone closer to home to cut their lawn next week because your expenses are going to be high. But you could have made a contract with a different person. I could have hired a different person to cut my lawn, or indeed I could have hired no one at all and you could have prudently stayed out of the lawn cutting business. But once we've made that, there's this contingency, and yet it has necessitation. Now, the idea that the people give the laws to themselves is just such a contingent, such a principle that connects a contingent matter with necessitation. That the laws are given turns on the thought that the law telling you how fast you're allowed to drive, telling you what forms you need to fill out in order to purchase land, the laws telling you that you have to pay your taxes. These are all positive laws. They are all laws that are contingent, that are in some sense chosen. That, of course, is why we care about democracy and why we care about elections. Because, of course, in a democracy, there are two kinds of contingency. On the one hand, there is the contingency of who it is that gets to make the decision, who it is that gets to decide what the tax rate will be or what the speed limit will be or any of those things. We care about those things because we know they're contingent. But we care about them in a way that we do not care about some other contingencies because, of course, we don't care about things except where they are contingent and they necessitate. Someone is going to get to make the rules for us. And they're going to be rules. We're going to have to abide by them, even though we would have had to abide by them if they had been different. Notice, there's a second contingency also, which, of course, I don't follow Mexican politics closely, but I can say without following it with some confidence that politicians, once elected, do not always do exactly what they said they were going to do during the campaign. This is a common problem, and so I'm sure you have at least some version of it here. Now, there's contingency because who does it and what they will decide is contingent. And the question is, how can that impose a requirement? And the appealing feature of democracy is that it offers, or at least the slogan that I mentioned earlier offers, a way of understanding those laws as being binding because they are ultimately self-imposed. It's not that you're subject to someone else's decision-making power. You're actually deciding for yourself. That's the picture that I want to redeem. But of course, it's puzzling. Let me begin by reminding you of certain tempting pictures of it that are obviously going to be doomed. The first picture says that we're bound by the laws because we have, in fact, consented to them. Kant quotes the Roman law maxim, volenti non fit injuria. You cannot be wronged by your own voluntary act. There's an empirical version of that that seems appealing, but completely hopeless for thinking about lawmaking. And so if you consent to have your physician perform a procedure on you, your physician does not commit the wrong of battery against you. On the other hand, the physician performs that without your consent, they do commit the wrong of battery. Your consent makes a difference there. But of course, that's not going to be a helpful model of voting. First of all, again, without knowing much about Mexican democracy, I suspect that you don't get a lot of unanimous elections. You don't get a lot of unanimous decisions in your parliament or in your Senate. And so not going to work. Empirically, it doesn't describe it. But in addition to those empirical difficulties, there are two formal difficulties. The first formal difficulty is that there are two different ways of thinking about the concept of consent in other contexts. The first of those is covered by the example of you consenting to the procedure by your physician, or in case the procedure involves anesthesia, a simpler example would be you consenting to your stylist cutting your hair. People who give unauthorized haircuts to people, this happens in other countries, and it is barbaric and it is wrongful. That there are other wrongs of greater magnitude, I don't need to deny, but it's wrongful. But you give your stylist consent, no wrong. But notice, if partway through the haircut, you realize the stylist is not doing a good job, you can say stop. You can withdraw your consent at any time. But that couldn't possibly be a model for public law, because of course it can't be that the laws necessitate you if you can withdraw from them at any time, if you can withdraw your consent. Of course, there are other ways in which you can agree to something that makes for a more enduring obligation, and that's by means of a contract. If you consent, if you agree to cut my lawn next week, just to stick with your earlier example, then you are bound to do so, even if you change your mind. Indeed, that's what it is for you to have a contract. It is a requirement that you do something, even if at the time of performance, your assessment of the merits change and you no longer want to do it. It really is an obligation. But the problem is that that can't be the right model for law giving either. It can't be the right model not only because you didn't actually agree to all of the terms of all of the laws, but more significantly, the bindingness of contract is one of the things that needs to be explained through the broader concept of legal obligation. You have to keep your contracts because there is a legal system in which contracts are binding. Your participation in that legal system can't be bootstrapped from a particular transaction within that legal system. So the first problem is that our ideas of voluntariness in private context don't seem to give us any kind of obligation in the public legal case. The second problem is a generalization of this first problem. The second problem is that the idea of consent in voluntary interactions like haircutting and surgery, or voluntary transactions like contractual agreements, is itself the wrong kind of thing because it is entirely private. It is just whether you make a contract with me or whether you agree to have the surgery done or have your hair cut, that's up to you. If the surgery is essential to you, or if, as happened to me during the pandemic, the haircut was essential to me. I did really well at cutting my own hair, and my students on Zoom didn't notice except until my wife's on the back of my head. It was essential that I get a properly done haircut, but it's still up to me. It can't be that the hair police can come and correct what I do not deny was an aesthetic wrong. They can't do it. Why? Because it's up to me. But if it's up to me, then it seems it depends entirely on what Kant calls the matter of choice, and it is private in a way that can't give you the right kind of public law. So if actual consent, as we understand it in private transactions, is not going to be helpful here, what about hypothetical consent? Hypothetical consent is a prominent theme in the history of political philosophy. It got a lot of renewed energy with John Rawls's theory of justice. And Kant talks about hypothetical consent too. Hypothetical consent is important in Kant, but it can't be used to explain democracy. The difficulty, of course, is that hypothetical consent sets a limit on the laws that can be made, but does not actually give you any explanation of how the laws are self-imposed by the citizens. Instead, hypothetical consent, Kant gives various examples of things to which citizens could not consent. I'll mention one now and come to another about which I have more to say in a moment, such as an ecclesiastical constitution. He says the citizens could not bind themselves in this way. That means that a government couldn't impose something like that. Why? Because this government can only impose that which the citizens are capable of imposing on themselves. But of course, that doesn't give us any role for the citizens in actually determining what the laws are. It instead sets out constitutional constraints on the lawmaking power of the government that is completely consistent with an autocratic government. It doesn't give you the right sense of things being self-imposed. And so you could imagine, and this is something that does not happen, but you could imagine a completely autocratic government that had a rich and detailed charter of rights for its citizens and honored it meticulously and never passed a law that was not consistent with citizens' rights. That wouldn't be an explanation of democracy, even though it would be much better than autocratic governments are likely to be. So, the key to understanding what Kant wants here, I think, can be brought out by thinking about his second extended example of a law that the citizens could not give themselves. Kant says that this is in part of the general remark to public right and the doctrine of right. Kant says that the people could not agree to a hereditary bureaucracy. Hereditary bureaucracy was a very big thing in modern Europe. Hegel likes the idea of hereditary bureaucracy. Once while teaching Hegel on hereditary bureaucracy to try and give my students the feel of them, I suggested that they read Thomas Mann's novel Buddenbrooks. But it turns out that assigning a 700-page novel to students as a commentary on Hegel, it didn't really work. But if you read that, they take it very, very seriously. And Kant says it could not be a law that the citizens could give to themselves. And so what I want to do is take that sentence apart. Why could the citizens not give that law to themselves? Well, what he says is suitability for government is not the kind of thing that can be inherited. Now, you might wonder about this. You look at the Buddenbrooks family, and you might say, it's just a novel, but how can there be an a priori principle that says that the next generation isn't good at governing? Maybe it's like in those Dune novels, right, where they're constantly doing selective breeding so the next generation of bureaucrats are well suited to their role. I don't think that's going to work, but that can't be Kant's argument. Because when Kant says that, is this microphone not working? Okay. When Kant says that suitability for government is not the kind of thing that can be inherited, by inheritance, he is not concerned with a biological category. He is concerned with a juridical category. That is, he is concerned with the fact that suitability for office could not be part of an official's patrimony. It could not be something that an official could bequeath to a successor. Why is that? Well, because an official could not give it to a successor, could not sell it to a successor, and therefore could not bequeath it to a successor because it's the wrong kind of thing. Now, how is that going to help us with democracy? Notice why it's the wrong kind of thing. I want to draw your attention to something else that has the same features, although there are no plausible mechanisms for inheritance here. But notice, your vote is something that you have. You have a right to vote, but it is not part of your patrimony. That is, not only can you not bequeath it to your successors, because the election's over by the time they inherit it, but more significantly, you can't sell it, you can't give it away, and you can't transfer it to another to exercise on your behalf. You can't say, oh, I'm going to be out of town, you go vote on my behalf. You can't do that because, or you can't say, I'm going to be out of town, you vote for whoever you want. It's not yours in that way, because it is fundamentally something that you have as a citizen, as a member of the public. And so it couldn't be subject to inheritance because it's not something that you have for private purposes. Okay, now let's go back to the public office, and we see a much more detailed and structured version of exactly the same picture. Because a public official is someone who has a particular mandate. They are charged with acting within their mandate. And part of what it is to be a public official with a mandate is to be in a position where there is a distinctive kind of wrong that you can commit as a public official, a type of wrong that a private person cannot commit. That is the wrong of corruption. Corruption consists in using your public office for an improper, which is to say, a private purpose. Now, once we see that that is a feature of public officials, go back to the problem with the hereditary nobility. Suitability for acting for public purposes isn't something that someone possesses the way in which they possess property, and so it can't be inherited like property. But then, having been shown by Kant's argument that this is not the kind of thing for which the citizens could give themselves a law, could not give themselves a hereditary bureaucracy. The question is, well, how then are public officials to be selected? Now notice that we have an answer to this inherent in our legal systems, but it's the answer that is also, as it were, built into the very idea of a public office. Because as I said, a public office has a mandate. The public official can only act within the mandate, cannot act beyond the mandate, cannot use the mandate to advance their own private purposes, nor can they use the mandate to advance public purposes other than those already contained in that very mandate. And so we had a case in Canada about 70 years ago in which the Premier of the province of Quebec was very concerned about the threat that various Protestant sects, particularly Jehovah's Witnesses, posed to the Catholic Church and thus to the culture of Quebec. And so he had them arrested, but there was no grounds for arresting them, and they all got bailed out, and they were bailed out by a restaurateur. And so he suspended the liquor license of the restaurateur who was paying their bail. And we might concede that he was acting for a public purpose. He wasn't allowed to act for that public purpose. He has a mandate. He can only act within the mandate. So now, how do we choose the people who act within the mandate? The answer is every office, every public office includes within it a mechanism for appointment and a mechanism for oversight. That is, why is it that the president is the president? The answer is that they're the person who won the election. That is the mechanism in the simplest form. But before going there, go directly to democracy, let me draw your attention to the way in which this structure works within the broader hierarchy of a legal system. So let's start with a low-level bureaucrat, the person to whom you go to renew your driver's license. that person is not allowed to play favorites. That person is not allowed to let the person behind you in line go in front of you because that person is friends with the official. But basically, they have a pretty one-dimensional role. They need to just make sure everything's in order and then take your picture or whatever, and then issue you the driver's license. But of course, most public offices, or many as you proceed up the hierarchy, are much more complicated than that. That is, most mandates have multiple elements to them. Most mandates require the official to consider multiple factors and to figure out how much weight to give to each of them. So here's an example which doesn't apply in Mexico, but is sufficiently low stakes to, I think, be helpful for illustrating things. It does, because a decision was made about this. Think about daylight savings time. So countries far from the equator change their clocks during their summer so that people have free time during daylight. And you can see the things to be said in favor of this. Part of the mandate of a government is to manage the economy, see to it that people are able to take proper care of families raising children, have time with their children, and so on. Various things like that speak in favor of it. Here's the thing that speaks against it. It turns out that when you switch from standard time to daylight savings time, the number of traffic accidents goes up because there are more tired drivers. You have more tired drivers 2 days a year. You have more accidents than you otherwise would. And of course, you have different accidents than you otherwise would. And so question, what do you do? Well, so this is, I don't think it's a deep question, but it is a question that illustrates these are obviously proper public purposes. And it seems to me that Mexico is close enough to the equator that it makes perfect sense for the government to say, well, on the one hand, we would like to be more closely aligned with our major trade partners. And on the other hand, that we shouldn't have the traffic accidents because it's not doing the thing to be family friendly and so on. And so you make the decision, different places make the decision different ways. But notice that the government that decides to institute daylight savings time and the government that decides against instituting daylight savings time, they're both acting within their mandate. Neither is doing anything untoward. Neither is passing a law that the citizens could not give themselves. They're just considerations on both sides. And there will be people who will object whatever result is decided, but that's how you decide. Okay, but notice that mandates have these kinds of features. The health department has a multifactorial mandate, has to figure out what to do during the pandemic. Do you close schools to protect hospitals, even though that this will have impact on learning outcomes and children's mental health? Or do you protect, or do you instead let the healthcare system suffer? And the answer is hard, but they can be acting within their mandate either way. Now, I don't mean to be making a suggestion about either of these examples. The point instead is that part of what it is to be a higher level public official is to be someone charged with making those kinds of decisions, either by making them ex officio from a particular position or participating in a procedure for reaching those decisions. Now, how do we appoint people like that to those roles? Well, it depends where they are in the bureaucracy or the hierarchy or the government. But the basic thought is that they will be appointed by those above them in the system. And then at some point, you get to the top. Now, how do you choose someone to engage in legislative action, that is, deciding what the laws are? So since this is a philosophy department, I will give you a small-scale example of how you are supposed to do it, which will be peppered with examples of how you are not supposed to do it. So, think about, suppose you are a member of a committee charged with deciding who's going to be the new head of the philosophy department. So there are certain factors that you should consider, and there are certain factors that you should not consider. Here's one factor you should consider. What are these persons' priorities likely to be? Here's another factor you should consider. How are these some soft skills, that is, how are they going to deal with unanticipated things where they might have the best ideas in the world, but somebody is resistant or something goes wrong that nobody had planned for? How smart are they? How much energy do they have? What are they going to regard as an acceptable compromise? What are they going to do when there is conflict? Those are all appropriate things. Here's a different thing that you might consider that you should not consider. Suppose that someone is a candidate who you don't think would be the best person for the job, but they're the other person who teaches your favorite course to teach, which is obviously the critique of pure reason. And so you say, you know what? Let's make this person chair, because then they'll get a teaching release while they're chair, and I'll get to teach my favorite course. You're not supposed to do that. Why? You're not supposed to do that because to do that would be corrupt. Why? Because you would be using your mandate as member of the selection committee for an improper purpose, a private purpose. Even if it is true, this is obviously all hypothetical, that you would do a better job teaching the first critique. You're allowed to act on that reason in the sense of trying to convince others to let you teach it. You're not allowed to act indirectly on that reason, trying to get the other competitor for it into the administrative position so as to eliminate them as a competitor for the position that you want. So notice that in choosing someone to do this job, your task has all of the features of a public office. You have a mandate. You have grounds you are allowed to consider. You have to figure out how much weight to attach to each of them, because the relation between somebody's organizational skills, their soft skills, and their priorities, there are lots of ways in which you could attach significance to each of them. You're not allowed to think about improper purposes. And so notice, if you're on this committee, you will have chosen the new administrator, but it is your job to do so in the right way and not in the wrong way. So I take it you can see where I am going with this. Because notice that in voting, you have all of the same questions before you. In voting, you have to choose a representative based on such things as the declared platform of that representative, the likelihood of that representative sticking with their declared platform, how good they are in a crisis, their ability to work with others, and more generally, their integrity. These are all obviously relevant. Now, how much weight do you attach to each of them? And the answer is, there might be some candidates, without naming any examples in any ongoing elections in any country, who do so poorly on one of those criteria that they should simply be beyond consideration. But if you have several imperfect candidates, which is obviously a real luxury in the world in which we find ourselves, if you have several imperfect candidates, then what you need to do, it is your job, it is your role in the public office of voter to choose the person who makes the laws based on their office. Now, I want to draw attention to several features of the picture that I have just presented to you. The first is the general feature that the role of electoral democracy is to provide citizens with a public office of choosing the people who make the laws. Second, I want to draw your attention to the fact that the legislators themselves, the elected representatives, they are, in a straightforward sense, already giving laws to themselves. Why is that? Because, at least within a constitutional order, the job of the legislative branch is to promulgate laws of general application, which is to say laws that apply to them as well as to everyone else. In the social contract, Rousseau has this mysterious character of the lawgiver. His examples are Moses, Lycurgus, and Numa. And they come in and they make the laws, and they make them from outside. They're not part of it. They are not subject to the laws that they provide. And then there's just this kind of ratification by the people. That's not the picture. The members of the legislature, by participating in legislation, give the laws which then bind. But now, if you participate not in legislation, I don't know if any of you are elected representatives. I actually this morning spoke on the phone to a friend of mine who is a member of the cabinet in Canada. And so I said, you get to make the laws, but you get to make the laws too. And here's why. Because notice that all that you are is the next layer up above the legislature. That's who the voters are. Now, notice also that in your role in appointment and also, of course, in oversight, because with periodic elections, you get to assess the job that the incumbent is doing. And that's part of what it is for them to be not acting on their own initiative, but to be properly public. But in your exercise of your powers of appointment and oversight, part of what your mandate includes is doing things considering many of the same factors that you might think it is the job of those you are overseeing to consider. You need to figure out if their priorities make sense, and so on. And that's true, but that doesn't mean that you are doing the same job as them. Your job has additional dimensions. It is your job to assess whether they are successfully executing their job. One dimension of that is, of course, whether they are attaching what you take to be appropriate weight to different factors. But another part of it is whether they are following through, whether they are avoiding corruption of various forms. And so you need to look at all of that, including the first order questions that the legislators are charged with asking themselves. Now, on this picture, then, notice there's a general structure. A public legal order is a system of offices. Every office has a mandate, every office has a mode of oversight, and every office has an appointment procedure. And the voters are the highest office. You might be puzzled then about the fact that the voters themselves are not subject to either appointment or oversight. That is, you become a voter by being a born or naturalized citizen of the country and nothing more than that. And of course, there are lots of voters who do a bad job of voting. Of course, there are probably fewer voters who do a bad job of voting than there are voters who are thought by other voters to be doing a bad job of voting. But there are lots of voters who do a bad job of voting. All of that is true. So question, why can't they be removed? Well, there's a political science interesting question that's philosophically answer that's philosophically uninteresting, and then there's a philosophically interesting answer. The political science interesting answer is, of course, any mode of oversight of voting is going to be run by someone and is likely to be corrupt. And so you look again in the US, things like ID laws, disenfranchising felons, and so on. There are lots of ways in which those things get used for improper purposes. And so that I call that a political science reason, because it's not philosophically interesting. That it is likely to be done badly is not a principled objection. It is just a caution. There are lots of things that are likely to be done badly, and it is bad policy to do such things, but that's not a principled objection to it. Here is the principled objection. Part one of the principal objection notes that if there were oversight and appointment requirements for voters, then those doing the oversight and appointment would be the highest level in the organizational hierarchy, and then the laws would not be imposed by the voters. The second thing to say is the people who are subject to the laws have the highest level of oversight because they are subject to the laws. The laws are therefore given by them to themselves. If you have electoral democracy, where legislation is of general application, then the highest level is just those who are subject to the laws. And so if we understand it this way, we can understand why there need be no appointment procedure, no procedure for removal, no procedure for oversight, and instead we can have a system within which everyone is entitled to participate in the making of laws. As participants in the making of laws, they are then engaged in law giving in the same way in which legislators are, which is to say that those who are outvoted, it's not that, as Rousseau suggests, oh, there's a moment of unanimity and we all agree to have the majority rule. That can't be it, because of course, aside from the fact that there was no moment of unanimity, more importantly, the moment of unanimity could have resulted in something else. If unanimity is authoritative, then there's nothing special about democracy. However, what's special about democracy is it is the way in which the laws can actually engage with the choices of the citizens. Now, this might seem like an unduly rosy picture of democracy. It might seem unrealistic in various ways, because, as I said, there are lots of voters who don't take their job seriously. And I think one virtue of this picture of democracy is that although in a certain way it might strike you as rosy or as unrealistic, in another sense, it helps us to understand in a principled way many of the pathologies of modern democracies. A philosophical theory of democracy cannot make people better, just as a philosophical theory of morality is not a kind of catechism that if only taught to the young, everyone will be good. That there's this picture where reading literature makes you morally better. My wife's an English professor. One of her colleagues said, if that were true, literature professors would be morally the best people in the world. That's not it at all. So too, moral philosophy may not make you better. Understanding the nature of democracy might not make you better, but maybe it will. But the way in which it will is by identifying what is wrong with the various familiar pathologies of modern democracies. Here are the four familiar pathologies. One of them is populism. Kant, in Towards Perpetual Peace, is sharply critical of Athenian democracy. Athenian democracy, he may be wrong about exactly what went on in the Athenian assembly, but Athenian democracy, as Kant characterizes it, is a system in which the collective exercises a principle of private choice. There is no division between legislative, executive, and judiciary. And further, people are entitled to vote for whatever private purpose they have. Here's another way of putting what's wrong with Athenian democracy as Kant characterizes it. In it, voters have no job description. They can do whatever they want. They can act for private purposes, but that means it's just, as Kant says, the worst despotism. But notice that populism, insofar as it appeals to the private choice of voters and their private advantage, is just the same thing. So populism is a system in which voters are urged to disregard their job description. Demagoguery is a problem because, again, voters are urged to disregard their job description and instead simply grant the power to the demagogue or to, there is a movement in the US and the UK, the UK is called the Judicial Action Project. In the US, it's called Project 2025, to basically say, oh, we should do everything to simply empower religious institutions. We should give up on our job. We should outsource our decision-making power to them. What's wrong with that? And the answer is, it's inconsistent with your role. You do not have the power to do that kind of thing. The Kantian picture also gives us an understanding of what is wrong with work and what's called the curse of money in politics. The way in which outcomes are so heavily dependent and predictably to all dependent upon the ability of candidates to raise money. Because raising money is in large part a way of distracting people from issues. And finally, I think it gives us a clear understanding of the pathology of single issue voting. There are lots of single issue voters, and there are many things wrong with single issue voting, but the most important is that if you understand the role of a voter as an office, and you understand the office to have a mandate and the mandate to have multiple factors, there can never be just one issue. There must always be multiple issues that you have to consider, even if you end up thinking this issue is so important that it outweighs the others. So what I've offered to you today is a way of understanding the sense in which laws can be self-imposed. They are self-imposed because they are imposed by every citizen acting in their official capacity as a citizen, as a voter. They are subject to laws, the matter of which they may not have consented to, but crucially, if every voter takes their mandate seriously, then they are not subject to any private choice. They are subject only to public choice. But the public choice is a reflection of their understanding of what proper public priorities are. And so the laws are not imposed by anyone other than them. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ripstein. Yeah, we're going to take, Aurelia told us, 10 minutes.
10 minutes, wow.
Make it a 7-minute break, okay? 7, is that okay? Make it a 7-minute break so we can be back before 10 minutes, okay?
Okay.
Keep your hands up, Juan, perdón, Espíndola. Yeah, please.
So thank you for the amazing presentation. I have just a couple of questions. The first one's very brief, and it's about I guess just a clarification question. And I was wondering if how does the account that you reconstruction of Kant's view on democracy differ from Rousseau's, and just in the idea of the general will, because it seemed to me that so to make the question more brief, so it seems like Rousseau got Kant right? And because like for me, at least in the sense that the idea of the general will, I think speaks to what you were saying. Like the idea of the general will is that people need to when they choose, when they make law, they are not to be thinking about what their private preferences are, but they have to have a sort of a sense of what the common interest is. So just the brief question was also, I think, so Rousseau was on the right track of interpreting that. But I mean the other way. Yeah. So, yeah, that's it. Yeah. And then the other question is about, you were saying that that for Kant there's each office has a mandate and then a mode of appointment. And I was wondering if there is a relationship between the two, in the sense that if the office has a certain mandate, then the mode of appointment has to be a specific one. And this is a question is just to involve you in Mexican politics. we have so there's currently a reform, proposed reform. I don't know if you've heard about it. So the proposal is that judges are elected by popular vote, and so and the idea is that to the extent that judges are supposed to just interpret, to weigh in on whether laws are consistent with the Constitution, then it might be a bad idea to at least to choose them democratically, given what we know about what democracy, how the popular vote works, with all the technologies that you mentioned that people might not be thinking about common interest, but their party interest. So the more specific question is whether there is this relationship between the mandate and the mode of appointment, whether for candidates they're related somehow.
Okay, thank you so much for both of those questions, Juan. So let me start with the first question about how this is related to the Rousseauian idea of the general will, because there are obvious connections between it, and indeed Kant uses the vocabulary of the general will. And so it shares features with Rousseau's account, because of course Rousseau, like every other serious thinker in the modern period, has the distinction between an office and the individual human being filling it. And so even Hobbes, with his absolutism, is perfectly clear on that distinction, though there are questions about whether he can tell his story. Grotius even gets that. It's fundamental in Locke, in his criticisms of Filmer, and so too Rousseau has it. And so Rousseau says there are different wills in each of us, and so when you are voting, the question is whether this is in conformity with the general will that is yours. And so similar, but here is a difference. Now, and again, Rousseau is slightly slippery on this, and in the social contract, he puts it in terms, he has this distinction between constitutional matters and business matters. Whether this bridge should be built is something where you can go with a majority. Constitutional matters, you need unanimity, he seems to say, though it's not clear. But the key point is that for Rousseau, when voting, what you're supposed to do is figure out whether it's in conformity with the general will. And having figured it out and been outvoted, then you come to the realization that you were wrong about the general will. And so it's a little bit like the way in which we might think about grammar. And so you have grammatical intuitions, as the linguists call them, about whether this is, whether this should take the subject form or the object form, bigger than me or bigger than I am. And in France, we have the Académie Française who just decides, and everyone else, they're just wrong. But you could imagine taking a vote. When I teach this material, I give the example about whether in the English language critique should be used as a verb. I do not think it should be, but most people do. And so does that mean I was just wrong? But maybe with respect to language, that's ultimately all you can have. That can't be Kant's picture with respect to voting. It's not that I was mistaken when I am outvoted. It's that the exercise of power that is inconsistent with how I would have exercised it or with what I would have recommended, so long as it is still consistent with the people giving themselves laws, is still an instance of that, is still self-imposed. Whereas in Rousseau's case, there's this penitential moment where the person who was outvoted has to acknowledge that they were wrong about what we are going to do. And so that's the difference. So Kant is definitely building on Rousseau, but doing this thing differently. Now, on your other question, so I don't want to get too involved in the particulars, not only because I know so little about them, but because last night I spoke to my wife on the phone and she said, did you see that the government of Mexico withdrew the credentials of the Canadian ambassador for opining on this judicial reform? And so until I'm safely on the plane, I don't want to say anything. But more than that, in terms of your general question, of course, you're right. The mode of appointment needs to be sensitive to the nature of the task. And so if the nature of the task is something, let me give a different kind of example. And this is an example that, in fact, in Canada during the pandemic was very heated. And then there's a parallel version of it in the US with respect to the head of the Federal Reserve. So you want the head of the Federal Reserve to be chosen based on their credentials as an economist. You want them, now economics is controversial in various ways, and economists disagree among themselves. However, even though they disagree among themselves, those disagreements mean that there could be people taking a variety of possible positions that are still serious economists. And then there are a whole bunch of other positions that are not positions about which economists disagree. So too with the medical officer of health. Each Canadian province has a medical officer of health who's in charge of the entire public health system. That person stands in a complicated reporting relation to the Minister of Health. The Minister of Health is a member of the cabinet, is elected. But the medical officer of health should not be chosen based upon their loyalty to the minister. Instead, they should be chosen based upon their expertise in public health. Again, sometimes public health is controversial. But what that gives you is kind of a picture of the way in which the appointment procedure should depend upon the nature of the question. And again, coming back to the case that was central to my examples, member of the legislature, that's not exactly an expertise position. Now, what to say about members of the Supreme Court? Well, there it seems like it is mostly an expertise position, and at the same time, there are a range of opinions about what counts as appropriate expertise. But there are some things that don't count as appropriate expertise. And so that kind of gives you a picture of how there must be a connection without me having opined about anything about which I ought not to.
Thank you. I have two questions. I really like your talk. The first one has to do with the anarchist challenge to authority more in general, and whether, this work you are doing can help us to try to, say something to the anarchists, especially with this idea of giving a law to ourselves. And you mentioned different ways to understanding consent and figuring out whether hypothetical consent, for example, sometimes this hypothetical consent is used as a way to trying to, respond to the anarchist saying, well, I was just born here, why would I abide to this law? And one response could be, well, if you think thoroughly about, the fact that you're in a just state, you would consent, even though nobody will ever ask you whether you should consent or not. Is this related to this project you have with, giving a meaning to this phrase of giving a laws to ourselves? Is this a way to tackle this challenge? And this also, my question is related to the idea of how you understand hypothetical consent in Kantian terms because of the things you said. That's just one question. A second very, very good question has to do you think that we can come up with a broader model of public reason from Kant on, the mandate of voters and which reasons they should consider when voting than John Rawls's very nice ideas on public reason? Because I'm always unsatisfied with Rawls's, limits to the idea of public reason, saying it's only for constitutional essentials, and the only thing that you have to do is don't give comprehensive reasons, and that's it. Yeah. Offer a public justification when you can, and I think that's too narrow as a model of public reasoning for us. And you mentioned several other things that perhaps Kant would say, for example, look at the platforms of the candidates, their integrity, the response to crisis, the likelihood to stick to their candidacy. Can we extract a broader, a bigger, and more robust normative model of public reason from Kant than Rawls's himself?
Okay, so thank you so much for both of your questions. So I didn't begin by saying the thing that one typically says, namely, this paper is part of a larger project. But this paper is part of a larger project. And this is kind of chapter 2 of a 3-chapter shortish book. And chapter 1 is about your first question, and chapter 3 is about your second question. So let me just say a little bit about each of them. So the response to the anarchist that I think the Kantian can give is not really about hypothetical consent. I think that the response to the anarchist that Kant can give is about the synthetic a priori, which is to say that the fundamental problem that the anarchist has an intuition which is loosely connected to something of fundamental importance, and then the philosophical anarchist takes it off in the wrong direction. Because the intuition is that the problem of political life is the problem about authority. This is, of course, one of the questions that the philosopher David Hills at Stanford says that philosophy answers questions that come naturally to children using tools that come naturally to lawyers. And so the childish question is, why do you get to make the rules? And that's a legitimate question. And it's a problem about authority. The Kantian insight is that the problem of authority is everywhere, and that the absence of public legal institutions is not a situation in which no one is subject to the authority of another, but is rather a situation in which everyone is subject to the authority of everyone else. So if you think about it, Kant has this sequenced argument. You think about your right to your own person. Our right to our own person could be consistent. Everyone, just again, speaking of childhood things, obeys the kindergarten rules. Rule number 1, keep your hands to yourself. Rule number 2, don't run with scissors. And then no one interferes with anyone else. Their exercises of freedom are going to be consistent, provided that everyone complies with the rules, even though there's no reason to think everyone would. But you can think of that kind of anarchy as the pure case of a state of nature as an idea of reason. As soon as you introduce anything as an object of an exercise of freedom other than your own body, then you have a problem about authority. Because supposing that Jorge's gift of this to me was perfected properly, that I now own this bottle of water, what's that to you? And the answer has to be, because notice, I have a kind of authority over it. I get to decide whether you can deal with this water. And my dealing with it applies not merely when I'm holding it, where you grabbing it would interfere with me, though perhaps you sticking a straw in and drinking it would not, but when I put it down. Why do I get to say that to you? And the answer is that could only be legitimate in a public legal order. And so as soon as we see that claims to anything other than your own person and require a public legal order, and as soon as we see further that the problem of authority comes up if we try to deny that you could have claims to anything other than your own person. Because, of course, that would mean that I could not, and this is not sufficiently bucolic, I think an apple would be better as an example, the classical example of property, because it's both original sin and then it's in Occam's letter to the Friars Minor, the example of distinguishing between property and usufruct. But the key point is that those kinds of things, it must be that people can use them, because the alternative would be a system in which everyone gets to determine whether anyone can use anything at all. And that would be a system of thoroughgoing domination. So it has to be that things that free beings are capable of using are available for use rather than subject to collective decision making. But that's only possible if we have a system of public law. And so if you set it up that way, then we need a distinctively public legal order, which consists of a system of public legal offices in order for people to be free. So that seems to me a different way of responding to the anarchist that does not require saying you would have agreed to this, but rather saying instead, this is the condition in which exercises of freedom by a plurality of persons can be consistent. Now, your second question about a broader model of public reason. So the basic Kantian thought is that the public use of reason involves the way in which people are able to communicate their thoughts to each other as members of the public. That means that there are going to be restrictions on how things can be said, but the Rawlsian restrictions, I share your misgivings about them. It seems to me that one part of your misgivings, again, I agree completely, is that it's restricted to constitutional essentials. And so Rawls has this famous sentence in which he says, when you're deciding what to say, you should ask yourself, how would this look in a Supreme Court opinion? Now, this comes back to Juan's question. You're not on the Supreme Court. When you are debating constitutional essentials, you are not asking whether this is within the confines of the constitutional order as laid out. You're asking a different question. You're not asking a question for an expert. You're asking a question for common human reason. Now, of course, the question you're asking is a question about freedom and dignity. You're not asking an untrammeled question. You're asking a question about the conditions under which we can live together as free and equal. But if that's your question, you're not asking the legal question. And so you need a different way of understanding what's included. And what's included is, and again, that this comes back to even though I said hypothetical consent wasn't part of the response to the anarchist, it's part of public reason. Is this a law that the citizens could give themselves? That's a question. But of course, also, when it comes to things that are not constitutional essentials, this is the second part of your question, the public use of reason means the use of reason putting things forward based on your view of their credentials. You are speaking, as Kant puts it, you are speaking as a scholar. You are not speaking as merely an official. Now, of course, officials, Kant thinks, need to use what he calls private reason, in the sense that they need to act within their mandate. You, as a citizen engaging in public debate, have a much broader mandate. And an important part of your mandate is to speak your mind. And so this Kantian view can then give you a sense in which the public use of reason is really going to be public. It's going to be public in the sense of being addressed to everyone, to your fellow citizens. And that means part of your job is, of course, not to appeal to things that you have no reason to suppose they would accept. But the idea that you can somehow rule it out as comprehensive, or indeed identify it as comprehensive in advance, doesn't seem to me to be the right way of doing it.
Axel?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this question may
Sorry, your name?
Axel.
Axel.
The microphone, yes. Okay, my question comes from somebody who doesn't do political philosophy, doesn't do Kant, somewhere, right? So it may be a very simple. So what I understood, part of what I understood is that not all public roles are public offices. Citizen is one of them, maybe the only one, but there is something like being a citizen, and with you as a citizen, it's not when you're acting like as a normal, like you cannot do anything as an individual that you can do as a person. So there are these restrictions. There's something like a mandate for citizens, but there is no external thing holding that restriction. That's where I got lost. Like, where did this restriction come from, right? For the other public offices, there is, there are external mechanisms, and there is the arbitration from the citizens themselves. But in the case of citizens, what is there instead in its place? That is my question.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. So it's certainly true that as a citizen, you are subject to restrictions, but you are not subject to oversight or enforcement of those restrictions. So when you ask, where do they come from? That question is, I think, ambiguous, because there can be a normative answer and there can be a positive answer. Now, in the case of a public official, the person at the Department of Highways who renews your driver's license, those two questions, the normative question and the positive question, kind of travel together. That is, the positive question is, well, it's because the person up in the hierarchy said, this is your job. But the normative question, of course, and this comes back to Juan's first question, is, of course, the person who says, this is your job, only gets to say this is your job because it is their job to do that. And it is their job to do that because of the person up above them. But notice, at every level, they do not have untrammeled discretion. They are instead required to make a determination based on their interpretation of the nature of their role. So, coming back to what I said at the beginning about the synthetic a priori, the fundamental question of right is, how is it that positive, that is chosen law that could have been different, could be binding, could really be law, could really impose obligations? And the answer then gets put in terms of the idea of creating a system of freedom. That means that at each stage, the positive matter of oversight and the method of removal, the mode of enforcement, and all of that. And so all of those things are going to be governed by the normative picture. So as we ascend, we will eventually reach a level at which there must be someone who is an unsupervised supervisor. Some countries, I don't know if Mexico does this, Brazil had this briefly, have a separate anti-corruption police force. And then there's a question, to whom does the anti-corruption force report? And the difficulty is that if they report to the government, then there is a problem. But if they don't report to the government, there is a different instance of exactly the same problem. Now, let's treat the voters as though they are, at least with respect to some aspect of oversight, a version of the anti-corruption police. They are inevitably, it can't be that everyone is supervised by someone, because whoever is then supervising then has no one supervising them, right? You can kind of have overlapping jurisdictions to limit things in that way, but that still doesn't change the fact that at a certain point, someone's decision is final. Here's another version of the same problem that shows up elsewhere in the legal system. The executive branch is charged with giving effect to, which is to say, among other things, enforcing the law. As such, the executive branch is not directly subject to enforcement. Now, you might say, oh no, but it has to be, because you don't have a system of right unless it's enforced. But crucially, the thing that matters, and the reason enforcement matters, is that everything be subject to law, not that everything be subject to enforcement. Enforcement is in the service of law. Oversight is in the service of law. So that means, where does the right of the citizens to be the highest level of oversight come from? Gets the answer that it is required by the system as a whole not being a system of dependence. The only way in which it cannot be a system of dependence is if the highest level is what in English parliamentary procedure is called the committee of the whole. That all of the citizens together giving the laws is the only thing that is consistent with it being a system that's fully self-imposed, rather than it being some version of Rousseau's lawgiver. That doesn't mean that there isn't a problem. But the problem, again, as I said towards the end of my presentation, the problem is inherent in any kind of system. What philosophy lets us do is understand the nature of the relevant principles and identify the problem. And sometimes, once we have identified the problem in the relevant sense, then it may be what I call the interesting political science questions come up. Can we design institutions that are going to limit the scope of this problem? The curse of money? we know exactly what to do about that. We have campaign finance restrictions. I don't know if you have those in Mexico. We have them in Canada. There are other countries between Mexico and Canada that do not have them. And that is a problem. The question, how do you get them to see that it's a problem and do something about it? That's a really interesting question, but it's not a question for philosophers.
Yeah, that was very clear. Thank you.
Jorge, and after Jorge, we'll take some questions from people who are online.
Thanks so much. It's related with the Axel question. If I follow you correctly, the right to vote is subject to certain obligations, but that picture go against with our more common idea of voting that reflects your preference as a citizen. So actually, if you grasp this former idea of the preference of the citizens, that means that voting is a private act. So it's against your idea. And that leads me to the second question, how your pictures falls within the realm of law and not virtue. Because if there's no external constraint, then it seems to me that it's the virtue of the citizens who needs to make that decision. I don't know.
Yes, no.
And just the obligated one, can divide as passive citizens and active citizens, and those actives, just the active citizens have the right to vote. How this match with your picture of voting?
Okay, thank you so much for all of those questions, Jorge. I had the privilege of having Jorge spend a term with me in Toronto and come to all of my seminars, and so it's just so great to interact with you again. So, the Kantian you asked three questions. The first is how this is related to the idea of voting as an expression of preference, and it is, as you noted, it's diametrically opposed to it. The idea that voting is fundamentally a private act is just the patrimonial conception. And if it were fundamentally a private act, as certain public choice theorists in the US suggest, for example, then it's puzzling why we would think that you shouldn't be able to sell your votes. Because if a vote is just, as it were, a vector to satisfactions, then question, am I more likely to be satisfied by voting in this election or by selling my vote? And the answer, I think, would almost always turn out, since so few elections are decided by a single vote, I'm not likely to make much of a difference. But nonetheless, though I won't make much of a difference, I can make a difference to myself by selling my vote to somebody else. And so that picture is diametrically opposed to the Kantian picture, but also I think it shows what's wrong with the kind of public choice picture that sees voting as a matter of personal preferences. And of course, lots of voters vote on their personal preferences. You get lots of politicians making campaign promises about, we're going to do this for this little tiny constituency. If I win the election, we're going to change the tax on this. And so in Canada, there was a politician making speeches about cutting the tax on pregnant mare urine, the keeping of pregnant mares for their urine, which used to be how they made birth control pills. Because it turned out there was a giant horse farm employing many thousands of swing voters. That's not what you're supposed to do. And so it seems to me, once we see that, we see what's wrong with the preference picture. Now, your second question, is this a matter of law, not virtue? And the answer is that not every matter of law is subject to immediate enforcement. And indeed, if we think about the task of a high-level public official, so, for example, in the US, judges have absolute lifetime tenure. In Canada, they have lifetime tenure, but subject to an age restriction. So they must retire at age 75. But they can't be removed except through an extremely complicated procedure. So they're basically free from removal. And so, are you depending upon their virtue in that case? That's analogous to what you're asking about the citizen. Now, why am I giving the example of the judge, especially since in response to Moises, I was critical of Rawls's asking how it would look in a Supreme Court opinion? The answer is that you could imagine a judge doing their job properly without necessarily being motivated by virtue. Suppose that they are motivated instead by a concern for professionalism. They've inculcated the social norms of the legal profession. They've absorbed them, internalized them, as the economists like to say, and they're doing it for that reason. That's not virtue necessarily. Second, going to the voter. The voter who takes it seriously could take it seriously without as such being virtuous. Kant draws an adamantine distinction between right and virtue and says duties of right can be enforced because of their subject matter. But he draws the distinction not in terms of the possibility of enforcement in every case. That's why he says within a Republican system of government, the legislature is the highest lawmaking authority. No one gets to make laws for the legislature. No one gets to impose force on the executive branch, and no one gets to judge the judiciary. And so together, the three coordinate branches form a system in which it is the rule of law rather than the rule of private choice, without it being the case that any of them is subject to immediate enforcement. Back to you as you vote, you're not subject to immediate enforcement, but the requirement incumbent upon you is a requirement of right. One more example, and then another thing about voting. In cosmopolitan right, which governs the relation between an individual human being and a legal order of which that human being is not a member, there is generally no enforcement mechanism. Cosmopolitan right gives you the right to visit. You must be allowed in to present yourself for social interaction without fear of danger. But they don't need to accept you as more than a visitor. But there's no mechanism for giving effect to that, but it is nonetheless an obligation of right rather than of philanthropy. The other reason it's not a matter of virtue, which I think is also important, is that for Kant, virtue is a matter of adopting the right ends. Right is a matter of using acceptable means consistent with the freedom of everyone else. It is a duty of right to restrict the way in which you use powers that the legal system has assigned to you, even if there is no way of enforcing your proper use of them. Virtue requires the adoption of an end, but you can satisfy the requirements of right even if you are doing it not for ends of virtue. And finally, Kant thinks that although virtue requires that we adopt ends, he also thinks that we can never be confident of which ends we have adopted. Kant says we will never know if we are acting virtuously or not, because whenever we probe our motives too carefully, the dear self will always present itself. We will always find some other motive that might explain it other than the motive of the happiness of others or our own moral perfection. And so we don't need virtue there. Finally, active and passive citizens. So Kant says some disturbing things about the distinction between active and passive citizens. That is, he has some examples that really bother us. He also has some examples that are kind of puzzling. That is, you're trying to understand what the difference is between the woodcutter who comes to my house and the person who sells me wood that he's already cut. But more than that, although the distinction is deployed in 18th century ways that are troubling to us, the distinction itself is in fact fundamental to the possibility of understanding what it would be to inhabit a rightful condition. So again, without that, I'm making assumptions here which are not true of, I know there's at least one of you of whom it is not true. But so those of you who are citizens of Mexico, you are active citizens. I'm a visitor. I am a passive citizen. What does that mean? That means that I have all of the rights of a human being. I have the right against people attacking me. I have the right to my property that I brought with me from Canada. And I also have the right to access courts and so on. But I don't have the right to vote because I'm just here temporarily. Now, there are hard questions about when someone's someplace temporarily for long enough if they can continue to be passive. Of course, that's a hard question. But that there is such a distinction, that distinction applies to children, for example, that they are passive, even though they provide the questions for philosophy. They are passive and they're nonetheless right holders. And so the picture that I have gives an explanation of why that distinction is so important, even if we are properly not merely uncomfortable, but appalled by Kant's examples deploying the distinction.
And our last question is from a person who is online. Efrain, please.
Okay, so thank you, Professor Ripstein, for the very clear and very compelling presentation. I've questions that have not been posed or answered yet. One concerns the limits of your picture. They're all related. The other question concerns very quickly oversight. And the last, populism. So the limits of your picture, I wonder if you would contemplate in your picture mechanisms, appointment and oversight mechanisms that are not electoral in a strict sense. In other words, if you would contemplate in your picture supplementary or even alternative mechanisms of appointing and having oversight over officials. So this is like the first question. You quoted the metaphysics of morals, and there the subject is the people, right? Whereas in consent, the subject is rather the individual reasoner or person or whatever. So this, I guess you know where my question is heading. It's also to do with Athens. So as I read it, the objection, so I go to quickly to the oversight. I think the only mechanism of oversight that you gave us is just repetition. It's more appointment. And I wonder if there is something else, like if you separate who decides from who makes the rules, and also from who applies the rules, would that be enough of an oversight mechanism to you, or would there be other mechanisms. And the last one, it's about populism. And it's very quickly, it seems to me that in your definition of populism, there is no way to avoid that electoral democracies become populisms in your sense. And, I wonder if you would have, or you would find in the whether you would find some redeeming features in what's been called populism. I know that would not be in your sense, right? But whether you would find another sense of populism, which would be more, redeemable or worthy or whatever. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much for this. Sorry, I just realized you were looking at the side of my head because I was looking at you. But all right, and now I'm not looking at you, but it looks like I'm looking at you, so I hope you're comfortable with that. All right, so you've asked about 3 overlapping questions. So one of those concerns whether you could have non-electoral mechanisms. And the answer is that it seems to me that what democracy gives you is a distinctive role for electoral mechanisms while allowing that there are, in another sense, non-electoral mechanisms. So despite the fact that in response to Juan, I said I wasn't going to talk about judicial appointments, you can imagine various ways in which you have elected officials and also, for example, members of professional associations of lawyers and perhaps sitting judges or whatever participate in this kind of decision making. If you have that, you have both electoral and non-electoral. The key point is that it is important that the laws be self-imposed. And so when it comes to the selection of, again, Minister of Health, you could imagine the medical association having medical officer of health, having the medical association having a distinctive role to play. In the same way, I assume in Mexico, you have government bodies that fund the arts. These should not be elected. They should involve leading people in the arts, exercising their professional judgment. You can have that kind of oversight, but you can't have that turn into a kind of separate fiefdom, because then it's not actually going to be public in the right way. And so you also asked, well, suppose that we draw a distinction between those who make the law and those who apply the law. Is that enough? Now, for Kant, that is, of course, the basic principle of Republican government, the separation of the legislative and the executive, because all application of law is itself subject to law. So you need that distinction. But now, there is a question, who is it that does those things? And here, once we have the distinction, we need to ask whether this is rule by the people over themselves, or whether this is instead rule by one group over another. You mentioned the distinction between the people and the individual persons, and indeed Kant, in describing his idea of the general will, describes it as the people omnis et singuli, that is, collectively and individually. Crucially, it is a matter of the people considered as a collective body making rules that apply to those same people considered as individuals. But the pure case of the people uniting their choice so that the law is self-imposed is the one in which the people collectively rule themselves individually through their institutions. a final word about populism. The reason that I define populism the way that I did is partly just from my distress at watching populist political rhetoric around the world, with people saying, basically making patrimonial claims. It belongs to us, or more likely the populist leader says, it belongs to you and only I can solve your problem. And aside from whatever misgivings we might have about the only I part of it, the one true sentence that Stalin said, no one is indispensable. More than that, the key point is that this is, to say it belongs to you, misunderstands the political relation and treats it as a private relation. So popular democracy, where the people are the ones that decide, sign me up. Populism, where the peoples are the ones that decide because everything is up to them, because it's a matter of private choice, that is, as Kant says, the worst despotism.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.